Okay, so we'll continue on with the deities and temples. We left off yesterday with Prabhupada was talking a bit about his own deities and how he had given those deities, Radha Govinda, to his sister, Bhavatarina, and she was looking after them. So, apart from the Radha Govinda deities that Prabhupada originally had, he also, later on when he retired from his family life, he moved to Jhansi. This was in 1950s. And Prabhupada had another deity there, a large one, of Lord Chaitanya. So on January the 19th, 1976, then Prabhupada was telling us a little bit about that deity and about his the events leading up to his coming to the West. We were in his room, myself, Madhvisa Maharaj, and I think maybe Bhavananda also was there. So when the guests left, this was on January 19th, Prabhupada relaxed in his room, reminiscing with Madhvisa and me about the years before he came to the West, telling us something of the sequence of the major events in his preaching life. In 1950 he said he left home, and in 1952 he lived in Jhansi. In 1955 he went to Mathura, and he gave his deity of Lord Chaitanya to Keshava Maharaj's temple in Mathura. So that deity is still there in the Keshavji map, and you can see it if you visit. It's on the altar there. In 1956 Prabhupada moved to Vrindavan. 1958 he wrote Easy Journey to Other Planets. 1959 he took sannyas. 1960 he began his work on the Srimad Bhagavatam. So 62 he finished and published part 1. 1963 he finished and published part 2. And 1964 he finished and published part 3. Then in 1965 he left Calcutta for the USA. These evening conversations are always sublime. Just being able to sit with Srila Prabhupada and hear him speak is so remarkably satisfying, especially when he recalls his young childhood experiences, the British rule in India, and his efforts to spread Krishna consciousness. So, actually later on Prabhupada also mentioned that he officially retired from family life in 1954, so sometime in the 50s. And he told me once about the circumstances of his leaving. And that was, I was giving him a massage in Hawaii in May of 1976, just giving him his evening massage, and then Prabhupada started chuckling, and then he asked me, he said, "You know how I left home?" And I hadn't heard the story actually, so I said, "No, Srila Prabhupada." So then he told me, he said, how, he said, "You know that story, tea or me?" And then he told me how, you know, he'd come home one time and he found that his wife had sold his Srimad Bhagavatams. She'd exchanged them for tea biscuits. So Prabhupada got really angry and he told him now, he said, "You either give up your tea or you give up your husband." And she said, "Oh, then I'll give up my husband." So he told me, he said, she thought that I was joking, but I wasn't. He said then, not long after that, he said, "I borrowed 10 rupees from a friend, I got on a train, and I never came back." I asked him, I said, "Where did you go?" He said, "Anywhere." So, be careful. Anyway, so Prabhupada had that deity of Lord Chaitanya, and then he was given to the Keshavji Mat, because, you know, Prabhupada, once he left Jhansi, he had a big house there, but then the governor of the state there, Munshi, his wife, Leelavati Munshi, she got her eye on that building. Prabhupada was renting it. And the man that owned the building, or the man that was managing the building, he had a cinema license. So, because he had many interests, so he had a cinema license, and that had to be renewed every year. So Mrs. Munshi put pressure on the collector, who was the man who issued the cinema license, to put pressure on the owner to kick out Srila Prabhupada so that she could get the building. So basically the man was told, "You won't get your license renewed if this building to Lilavati Munshi. So they knew there was some intrigue, and Prabhupada said he had many big lawyer friends who could have helped him, and they told him, just stay, we'll help you, we'll make sure that this doesn't happen. But then Prabhupada, he said that he thought, well, I've just given up all of this business, doing business, legal affairs and all these things. Now again, I come here to preach, but if I again get involved in all of this, then what's the use? And actually, he said, I wasn't doing much then. He made one disciple. That was Prabhakaracharya, who became Hari Das. He was initiated. He had some medical students that were living with him in Jhansi, but they weren't really serious. They liked what he was doing, but they weren't serious to take it up full time. Even the one that he initiated also, he wasn't really serious. And then Prabhupada thought, what's the use? So he was in touch with Keshava Maharaj. He was one of his friends, and he had sometimes invited Keshava Maharaj to come to Jhansi to do some programs. So then he was invited, all right, you just come to Mathura, you stay with us. So he went to Mathura, of course, and then he put his deity on the altar there. But then after a few months, he didn't find it very satisfactory, living in his godbrother's mutt. Because, that meant that he was obliged to follow what they were doing in the mutt. And he had his own program. He wanted to publish his Back to Godhead magazine. So he wasn't going to be able to do that if he stayed in the mutt there and had to follow, their programs. So after a few months he left there, then he went to Vrindavan, and he had this place at the Bamsi Gopal Mandi. First of all, he came to Imli town. He had another godbrother there, and he had a place in Delhi. So Prabhupada went to Delhi. Of course, in Delhi, that was where he was able to publish his Back to Godhead. So then, from Imli town, then he moved to Delhi, and he was living there alone, and struggling really, just trying to produce Back to Godhead. He was writing it, he was editing it, he was doing the layout, he was buying the paper, he was supervising the printing, and he was selling it. And he used to go out in the street and just go from one place to another, trying to get people to buy his Back to Godhead. One time he told me that he developed brain fag. There was some managerial meeting that we'd had in September of '76, and then at one point Prabhupada started rubbing his head, and he said, now we have to stop. He said, I've got brain fag. So I didn't know what brain fag was, and I said, Prabhupada, what's brain fag? So then he said, brain fag. He said, one time in Delhi, then I was out selling my Back to Godhead, and he said it was very hot, so I was going from one place to another, I got brain fag. So he said I was reeling like a drunkard. And then, he said I had no money for a taxi or anything. And then just at that moment, a friend of his went past in a car and saw him. So he stopped, took him in the car, took him home, and then he gave him some medicine, and then he said that cured it. So it's like heat stroke he got. And brain fag means the brain actually stops functioning. And then of course, if your brain's not functioning, then your body doesn't function either. So that was Prabhupada's effort. Anyway, he was in his retired stage there, living in Delhi, and then he got the opportunity to get this room on the top of the Bamsi Gopal temple, which is just right next to the Kasigat Palace. There's Kasigat, there's that big, huge old palace. Right behind that, there's this small temple. And up on the roof, Prabhupada had a room, and you could see the whole Jamuna, and you could look actually right across Vrindavan from there. So he was there for a few years. Then the Radha Damodar Mahan there, what was his name? Gaucham Gosai. He offered Srila Prabhupada that, now I have these 2 rooms, so why don't you take them? They need fixing up a little bit, but if you want, you can have them, and I won't charge you any rent. So Prabhupada, he saw one room was being occupied, or had been occupied, by some man that was paying 3 rupees a month. And then the other room needed fixing up. So Prabhupada had to spend a little money of his own. So he thought, well, he was getting 3 rupees a month for one room, I'm getting 2 rooms, but I have to spend some money, so I'll give him 5 rupees. So he was giving him 5 rupees, and he was living at the Radha Damodar, and then of course from there he came to the West. Anyway, so a little bit of Prabhupada's history. But he did say at one point that he officially retired at 1954 when he was 58 years old. And then, he was able to dedicate his time full time. Now when Prabhupada came to the West, of course, he did bring some deities with him in a box. And on July 9th, 1976, when Prabhupada arrived in New York, this was the last visit that he paid to New York, exactly 10 years since he had started ISKCON. So as Prabhupada walked through the corridors leading into the temple room, devotees on all sides bowed low as he passed. Prabhupada held his cane between his 2 hands and then raised them to his chest in pranams, gratefully accepting their obeisances, gracefully accepting their obeisances. He stopped for a moment outside the temple entrance, admiring a beautiful diorama of Lord Krishna seated on a rock with his arm around a calf that the devotees had placed in the recess of the doorway. Then he entered the temple room to greet the most benevolent and wonderful deities of Sri Sri Radha Govinda and Sri Sri Gauratai. Again, Radha Govinda. Prabhupada's first deity he ever worshipped, of course, was Radha Govinda. He had his small deities of his own, Radha Govinda. And New York was the place where he started the Krishna consciousness movement in the West. Again, he called that deity Radha Govinda. So, and Gauratai, Lord Jagannath, along with his brother and sister, who were, of course, in convalescence prior to their Rath Yatra festival. So that year was the first Rath Yatra in New York as well. So the small brass Radha Krishna deities whom Prabhupada had worshipped when he first came to the West were also on the altar. Now, as far as I know, they're still there in New York, because the temple's back in Brooklyn now, but as far as I know, those deities are still there. Now, the first big set of deities, that was the first set of deities that Prabhupada brought to the West, but the first big set of deities were not installed in America, they were installed in London, around London Ishwar. And there was a whole story about that, of course. I'm not going to give the whole thing here, but it did come up one time when Prabhupada was in Calcutta in January 15th, 1976, and Tamal Krishna Maharaj had just come on for that month as Prabhupada's secretary. He'd arrived on the 1st of January. And so when we got to Calcutta, we were just, relaxing in Prabhupada's room. And Tamal Krishna Maharaj recalled how Prabhupada had personally obtained the London deities, Sri Sri Radha London Ishwara. Prabhupada had been invited to London to officially open the temple, but the deities that had been ordered had not arrived on time. Only a few days before the proposed installation date, the devotees had spotted some Radha Krishna murtis in a shop window. Prabhupada immediately went to the shop and persuaded the owner, an Indian man, to let him have them. Even as he and the man spoke, Prabhupada ordered the devotees to carry their lordships into a waiting van, despite the man's hesitation. So later Prabhupada settled everything very amicably with him. So these reflections on his past struggles to establish ISKCON reveal just a hint of his inner, intimate, and to us, hidden relationship with their lordships. Prabhupada's smiles and laughter at Tamal Krishna Maharaj's recollections made me wonder what kind of a special leela he had with Radha London Ishwara. Prabhupada said that they are the best in the society, the first large deities to be installed. Because that was just a very brief overview, the details of it. I might have got a little bit of the detail wrong there. But basically, what was the man's name? Goyal or Doyal? Mr. Doyal? Doyal, yes. He had these deities, and then they were going to put them in some kind of Hindu society that they had. And then, I don't know exactly how he heard, but I think he contacted the devotees and told them, I have these deities, but we're not going to use them, because there was apparently some kind of what he thought was a flaw right around his finger was cracked or something like that. So his idea was that he just imported them, he bought them, so he wanted to sell them to the devotees. So when Prabhupada heard these deities are there, he immediately told the devotees, you take me there. I think Tamal Krishna Maharaj and Srila Prabhupada, they went there with Prabhupada. And when they came to the man's house, there Mr. Dayal, he invited him in, and he had the deities covered, with a cloth, standing in the room. And he, of course, wanted to immediately start talking about the deities because he wanted to make a deal. But Prabhupada wouldn't talk about them. He just came in and he said, oh, how are you, what's your name, what do you do, where are you from, like this, and he was just small talking. And Mr. Dayal wanted to talk about the deities, and Prabhupada wouldn't do it. And finally, after some time, he was getting anxious. So then Prabhupada finally said, oh yes, so let's see. So then he had Tamal Krishna Maharaj take the covers off. And then he was looking at the deities, oh yeah, very nice. And then he told Tamal Krishna Maharaj, he said, just pick up maybe Radharani or Krishna. So he picked up one, and Tamal Krishna Maharaj understood what Prabhupada was going to do. And he picked up the deity and he said, oh, it's not heavy, Srila Prabhupada, like this. And then Prabhupada told Shama Sundar, now you pick up the other one, like this. So he picked up, and he also, it's not heavy, Prabhupada. And then Prabhupada said, all right, put them in the van. And they just started walking out the door. And Mr. Dayal is still, but Swamiji, we haven't talked about, this. And then Prabhupada said, that's all right, we'll talk later. And he just walked out with them. Jai Shri Shri, Kodani time, So he put them in the van. Prabhupada got in the van and they drove off. So that way then, later on of course he, negotiated with Mr. Dayal. He got him to donate the deities. But anyway, that was, what happened was that they drove around the corner, and as soon as they got around the corner, Prabhupada said, stop the van. And he jumped out, went in the back and offered his obeisances to the deities. And then of course they were installed a few days later. So anyway, as Prabhupada said there, he told me on that occasion that they are the best in the society. Now later on, in 1976, we went to New Vrindavan. And there was one devotee there who had been one of the early London devotees, Kulashekar. I don't know if any of you know Kulashekar. He was a very eccentric person, young boy actually when he joined. His dad was a docker on the London docks, nice man, and he had actually chauffeured Srila Prabhupada one time when Prabhupada visited London. And Kulashekar, was full of enthusiasm, but he was wild. He was the one who fell through the skylight when the Beatles were recording. And he had sneaked to the house there, got up on the roof and was looking through the skylight to see them recording, and he leaned over too far and fell through the skylight and landed at the feet. The Beatles are all there in their recording studio. And apparently John Lennon, he didn't bat an eyelid, and he says something like, I think this one's for you, George. Anyway, he was quite a character. So he had left London and he had moved to New Vrindavan. So he was there when Prabhupada came in June of 1976. So on June the 24th, Kulashekar is now producing the Brijbasi Spirit, a magazine about New Vrindavan. Advanced copies are sent to His Divine Grace, and the last issue came while we were in Hawaii. Kulashekar bore the latest, which he laid on Prabhupada's desk. It featured a beautiful picture of Sri Sri Radha Vrindavan Nath, the deities of the original New Vrindavan farm. Prabhupada asked Kirtananda Swami to make arrangements for him to go up to the old farmhouse. So he saw that picture and he said, oh, and then let's go and have a darshan. So Kulashekar Prabhu expressed his feeling that the main deities in New Vrindavan, Sri Sri Radha Vrindavan Chandra, were even more beautiful than Sri Sri Radha Landanishwara, who were the first set of big deities to be installed in the society. But it seemed that he had a partisan purpose and wanted Prabhupada's support. So he said it in such a way that he was hoping Prabhupada would say yes, like this, because now he was a new Vrindavan man instead of being a London man. So initially Prabhupada said, oh yes, but it wasn't clear, but it was clear that he said it more to maintain Kulashekhar's enthusiasm than from his own conviction, because then he immediately modified it and he said, London differently. Vrindavan Chandra is village beauty, and he is London beauty. He is town beauty. So encouraged, Kulashekar pursued his line of thought. I have not seen more beautiful anywhere than Radha Vrindavan Chandra. The jewelry and... No, Prabhupada told him evenly, everyone is beautiful, but everybody praises our London deity. Oh, they have not yet seen Radha Vrindavan Chandra, Kirtananda Maharaj suggested. Prabhupada smiled, but he wouldn't be drawn. No, they've seen the picture. So he wasn't going to give them an endorsement so then they could advertise. Prabhupada said, you know, Vrindavan Chandra is the most beautiful deities. Prabhupada wouldn't be drawn. So anyway, the following month, just on a month later, we were in London. Prabhupada had arrived on the 21st, but he'd been very, very sick coming over on the plane. He had a heavy cold when he got on the plane, and then by the time he got to London, he was really seriously ill. And he even asked for a wheelchair to be brought to get him off the plane. That didn't happen, but on the way to the manor, he had, we had to stop the car twice. Prabhupada vomited. So as soon as we got to London, then immediately at the manor, he immediately went straight to take rest, and practically he spent the first 2 or 3 days in bed. He came down briefly to see the deities on the second day, but apart from that he was resting most of the time. He wasn't taking his massage, and even when he did take his massage, it was only, I gave him a dry massage one day, and then when he started taking his bath again, it was just with a wet sponge, but not like a full bath. So he was quite, sick. Still, on July the 25th, Prabhupada decided he wanted to go and see Radha Landanishwara. So there was no special program that had been arranged there, but Prabhupada decided he just wanted to go and have a darshan. It was also a Sunday. So Prabhupada went ahead with plans to visit the temple in London. Although he's still very weak and his respiratory tracts are thick with mucus, he just went to have a darshan of Sri Sri Radha Landanishwara. They were the first lives deities he installed in the West, and he has a special affection for them. Before we left, the devotees came in with the Observer. So Prabhupada had done an interview with the man from the Observer a couple of days before, which carried a 4-column article by Colin Cross on his meeting with Srila Prabhupada. Actually, it contained very little of Prabhupada's own words. It was mainly an essay on Colin's own impressions, interspersed with various facts about Srila Prabhupada and the movement. He described his interview as an unnerving experience, and his meeting with several shaven-headed devotees as oddly disquieting. But it was generally favourable, and at least it contained the whole Maha Mantra. His description of Hari Kesh gave us a laugh, because Hari Kesh was Prabhupada's secretary. He'd just been brought back on the party as the secretary, and he was the one who had first greeted Colin Cross when he came to the manor. So he wrote, eventually His Divine Grace's private secretary, a monk with a face and manner that would not have been out of place at the Vatican, arrived to say that the moment for the audience had come. So Hari Kesh happens to be from an Italian family. So we kind of laughed at that, but he made this comparison. It looked like somebody out of the Vatican. So on the way to London, I was thinking about the conversation with Kulashekar Das in New Vrindavan, and Prabhupada's unwillingness to declare that Sri Sri Radha Vrindavan Chandra were more attractive than Sri Sri Radha Landanishwara. So I asked Srila Prabhupada if Radha Landanishwara were indeed his favourite deities, and Prabhupada said yes. So there was no question. So then we arrived at Bury Place. Actually, on the way in, we stopped at Soho Street, and that building there was up for sale. So Jaitirtha was the GBC at that time, and he asked Prabhupada, we found this building, it's in central London, and we're thinking of buying it. So Prabhupada went there and he looked at it from the outside. We couldn't see inside. But as soon as he saw it, he said, yes, buy it. Because at that time, we were in Bury Place, but Bury Place, there were a lot of problems with the neighbours. They were always complaining. And the city council were trying to get rid of us. So we were fighting there. So sometimes we won, sometimes we lost. And our situation there was very tenuous. So, arriving at Bury Place then, there has been a tremendous push by the neighbours to have the temple closed down. But somehow or another, the devotees have managed to keep ahead of the city authorities and stay open. Prabhupada was very pleased to see how the devotees were looking after the deities. Offering his dandavats and taking a little charanamrita, he sat on his vyasasana in front of their lordships and gave a talk, encouraging the devotees to continue on without being disturbed. Citing the examples of Prahlad Maharaj and Haridas Thakur, Prabhupada told his disciples to follow the advice of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. You should always expect some obstruction by the demonic party. That is not very astonishing. But still, we have to do our business and be tolerant. Be humble, be tolerant. Don't be agitated. Then your business will suffer. This is Maya's kingdom, and the test is always there. Combating is always there, and Maya's party is very strong. Especially in the present moment, Kali Yuga, the atheistic persons are almost everyone. Describing the material world as a very dangerous place, he advised the devotees to remain sober. They should stick to the spiritual principles, read his books, and avoid being discouraged. If the karmis were successful in having them evicted, he said, Lord Krishna would certainly provide another suitable place. But you go on executing your routine work, he said. I'm very glad to see that you're taking care of the deities very nicely. Whenever I come, I see. So this is very encouraging. So God consciousness means you have to face difficulty, but you should not be discouraged. You should go on with your business. Then success is sure. When there is a difficulty, a devotee thinks, it is my good fortune that Krishna has given me some difficulty to counteract my bad action, my previous bad action. So in this way, if we live, then mukti pade sadaya bhak. If one is not opposed by all these difficulties, and with determination he goes forward, then for him, going back home, back to Godhead, is guaranteed. Dayabak means it is inherited. So just like the son gets the father's property, so there's no law to check that. Similarly, those who are humbly, tolerantly, going on with Krishna consciousness, with full determination, for them, going back home, back to Godhead, is fully guaranteed. So that was nice. Prabhupada was encouraging the devotees. Don't be disappointed if people are, causing problems. That's natural. You're in the material world. You can't avoid that. But just depend on Krishna and he will provide everything that you need. And of course he did. Later on we had to move out of Bury Place, but we bought Soho Street. And now that, of course, for the last, 30 years or so, that's been very, very successful. So, anyway, so that's Radha Landaneshwara. Another deity that Prabhupada had a special leela with was Sri Sri Radha Rasa Bihari in Bombay. Because the whole history of the Bombay Juhu Beach property there was also fraught with difficulty. So anyway, on December the 17th, 1975, Prabhupada was in Bombay, and Prabhupada was out walking on the beach there. Now there was this man, Dr. Patel. He was a very small guy, about 5 foot nothing, and a very boisterous, loud voice, and pushing. Now he had seen Srila Prabhupada walking on the beach with his Western disciples, in the early 70s when we first got the Juhu Beach property. And he used to walk, daily up and down for exercise. People in India do that, just at dawn they go out and they walk. So he came over and introduced himself, and then he began walking with Prabhupada. So then it became, a daily affair. He just got attached to Srila Prabhupada. And so whenever Prabhupada was in Bombay, Dr. Patel would come and walk with him on the beach. And at the same time, it was a kind of like a funny relationship, because Dr. Patel was a full-on Mayavadi when he first met Prabhupada. And he used to challenge him all the time. He would bring up some argument, or he'd make some comment about, the British history in India, or Indian culture, or whatever. And Prabhupada would always disagree with him. And he would, they would get into arguments, and Prabhupada would always defeat him. But he was very pushy. Like our mood was very submissive. We would raise a point, Prabhupada would answer it, and that would be it. We wouldn't argue. But Dr. Patel was very boisterous, and he used to like to really push his points. So sometimes the devotees didn't really appreciate, Dr. Patel's, dealings with Srila Prabhupada. But the fact was that Dr. Patel became a devotee from these exchanges. He gave up his Mayavadi views. He started reading Prabhupada's books, and he became a bhakta. And he used to regard Prabhupada as, his guru. So anyway, they had a nice relationship on one level. So this particular morning we were walking down the beach. Dr. Patel introduced another admirer as being a renowned poet from Dwarka. His name was Betai, which means coming from the Dwarka Bet. So Dr. Patel mentioned that Mr. Betai only wrote poems about God. Prabhupada good-naturedly quoted a Bengali poem that wherever one finds himself, he should neither perform religious acts nor sinful ones. He should simply always remember the lotus feet of Krishna. So this prompted Dr. Patel to voice a complaint about how our pujaris dress the temple deities. Sir, lotus feet. These people are actually putting on such a long varga dress. I am trying to see the lotus feet of God here, Archa Vigraha. Well, I am unable. Instruct them to put up the varga a little, so that we can have a darshan of his sacred feet. Please tell them, too long vargas, you simply can't see anything. So there was always this little bit of animosity in the dealings between the devotees and Dr. Patel. Because he was, in his late, I guess he was in his late 50s at that point. He thought, the devotees, they're all young boys, they should offer him more respect. And of course, we didn't always do that, especially when we saw him, debating with Prabhupada. So he had this kind of little bit of acrimony in his dealings with the devotees. So again, he was complaining, now they're not putting the dress up so we can see Krishna's lotus feet. Giriraj patiently explained that the deity's feet can always be seen throughout the day, but when they wear their night clothes, the feet are not visible. Since Dr. Patel only comes early in the morning, when the deities are still in their night outfits, he never gets to see Krishna's feet. So there seems to be a mild acrimony in Dr. Patel's dealings with the devotees. He behaves as if he ought to be given some special entitlement by us as a learned and elderly person. And he tries to play off his relationship with Srila Prabhupada to extract some special attention. At any rate, in this instance, Prabhupada didn't take the matter too seriously. His mind was working in a different way. Whether the Lord's feet were visible or not, he was content that after the long, hard struggle to establish the temple on Hare Krishna land, that their lordships are still with us. Prabhupada's response to Dr. Patel's complaint was thus full of gratitude and appreciation. How he is sat tight to call everyone to come and see him. The municipality came to drive him away. So for several years, Prabhupada has fought on Sri Sri Radha Rasabihari's behalf. The previous owner tried to cheat Srila Prabhupada out of the land, while the municipality had presented severe objections to the building of the temple. At one time, they had even half demolished the deity's temporary shelter. They'd burned the roof support poles with oxyacetylene torches, and they had carried the protesting devotees off in a police truck. They even went so far as to begin ripping off the roof of the deity room, with Sri Sri Radharasa Bihari still inside. Only a last-second intervention by a few favourable people in local government prevented the total destruction. So that was the a little overview of what happened there, because there was a struggle for several years to get that land. Prabhupada put his deposit money down, and the man that was selling it, Mr. Nair, he was a former mayor of Bombay. He tried to rip Prabhupada off, basically. I guess he thought that Prabhupada was an old sadhu that didn't really know much about money dealings. And the Westerners that he had with him must be loaded, right? So he figured he'll sell it to Prabhupada, and then after taking the deposit money, then cheat him out the deposit money and resell the land to somebody else. And that way he'd make a few lakhs profit. And he didn't know who he was dealing with. Prabhupada knew very well. He was much smarter than Mr. Nair was. And as soon as Prabhupada put the deposit money on the land, he immediately had the devotees move on to the land. There was no place for them to stay, actually. There were 6 two-story buildings. And all of these are apartment blocks, all of them were occupied. So there was no flats available. Prabhupada just had the devotees move on and live in a tent. And at the same time, they'd have this cross Maidan pandal, big, huge thing. 20,000 people were coming every night. It was a huge success. And Prabhupada, I don't know where he got Radharasa Bihari from originally, but at that pandal, Radharasa Bihari were installed, and they were being worshipped every day at the pandal. And the devotees at that time were staying in a small flat on Marine Drive called the Kashganga, the building. And so then they had the deities in this Kashganga flat for some time. Then Prabhupada got this land, Juhu Beach. Now apparently he had seen that land before he came to the West, and he had, in passing, and he had thought that actually this would be a nice place for a temple. So later on, when he came back with his disciples to Bombay, that land was for sale, so he wanted to get it. So anyway, he had the deities moved from the flat onto the land. And they built this temporary hut, just like a small brick building with a tin roof. And then there was some darshan area in the front, which was just steel poles and a tin top. And that was the Bombay temple for a number of years, whilst they started to build the main temple. So anyway, as soon as they moved on, then this Mr. Nair started trickery. And he was trying to get the, agreement rescinded. And at one point, he actually succeeded. He actually had our devotees, Brahmananda and Tamal Krishna Maharaj, actually signed away their rights to the property. And Prabhupada was up in Ahmedabad and he heard about it, he rushed straight back down, and then he immediately, squashed that, whatever it was that they had signed, he got it back again. So there was a big fight going on. And at one point they tried to get rid of Prabhupada's disciples and the deities. I think this was after Mr. Nair had died. I think in 1973, Mr. Nair died. Prabhupada was in New Zealand at the time, and Giriraj he rang up and he informed Prabhupada Mr. Nair has died of a heart attack. Prabhupada said, Hari Bol. He said, we're Vaishnavas. He said, we shouldn't pray like this, but he said, this man was causing so many problems. He said, I just prayed to Krishna that somehow or another he'd be removed. Giriraj had gone out, he was giving sweets to everybody to celebrate. Mrs. Nair was there, she burst into tears. Anyway, still Prabhupada had to deal with Mrs. Nair, and she was continuing on. And at a certain point they got a demolition order, and so they came on a Sunday and started this demolition. Now, one man that played an important role in this was a man called Mr. Sethi, Mr. P.L. Sethi. When Prabhupada had got the land, because there was nowhere for his disciples to stay, he had an extra floor built on each of the buildings, so like a third floor built. And the man that he contracted to do that was this Mr. P.L. Sethi. He was a Punjabi. And he had, originally I think he was from Chandigarh, but he had a place just nearby in Juhu. So he was living there, and he was a building contractor. So he became very attached to Srila Prabhupada, and he became one of our first life members. And he built these extra floors. So then, later on, when this demolition thing came out, he played an important role in helping to, keep the temple going there. So on October the 15th, 1976, Prabhupada had gone up to Chandigarh, and we were staying at Mr. Sethi's house. He had allowed one of the devotees, Chaitya Guru, to use his house in Chandigarh as a temporary ISKCON temple until we could get our own place. And then they arranged for this 5-day pandal. So Prabhupada went up there to Chandigarh, and we were staying there with Mr. Sethi at his house. So during the darshan in the afternoon, Prabhupada was praising Mr. Sethi. He is a Punjabi, and the Punjabis are famous for their Kshatriya traditions. While Mr. Sethi humbly listened at his side, Prabhupada told us about his bravery during the days of the partition and Indian independence. Now, the partition was when Pakistan was partitioned off, East Pakistan and West Pakistan. So in the conflict between the Hindus and Muslims, there were many acts of terror and unprovoked attacks. Setiji had a sword which he used to carry for his defense. One time he was walking along a road, and several Muslims suddenly jumped down from a carriage and began running at him with their knives in their hands. Mr. Sethi whirled his sword and in one blow lopped off the head of the leader. The hapless fellow's headless trunk continued to run down the road for several meters before falling into a ditch. The rest of his would-be assailants ran in fear of their lives. We all looked on in wonder at the thought of the ghastly scene, and Prabhupada's eyes opened wide in emphasis as he described the bravery of Mr. Sethi. Yes, he said, this is Kshatriya. Prabhupada told us that story. Mr. Sethi was sitting there, just... So anyway, Prabhupada also told us that the establishment of the Juhu Beach Temple was accomplished only after a great struggle, and Mr. Sethi had played a significant role in it. At one point, the wife of the former owner of the land, Mrs. Nair, had enlisted the Bombay Municipal Council through one of its members, Pushpakant Matre, to issue a demolition order on the temporary temple. A large team of police and a demolition squad had invaded the land, and while the police dragged away the protesting devotees, they began to dismantle the entire structure. Just as the demons were ripping off the roof of the deity room, with Radharasa Bihari still inside, the demolition was stopped by the intervention of Bal Thackeray, who was the leader of the Shiv Sena, a local political party, who was friendly with the devotees. Mr. Sethi had come later on for darshan and was informed of the demolition by Giriraj Prabhu. He wasn't there at the time, but later on he came in, it was a Sunday, and he came and he saw what's going on here. The whole temple was just, practically demolished. So he was told that the court had granted permission to rebuild the temple, but it had to be done that day, which was on a Sunday, because another High Court hearing was scheduled for the following day, on Monday morning, to finally decide the issue. Mr. Sethi immediately assured Giriraj that he would reconstruct the temple that very day. Despite everything being shut, Mr. Sethi managed to arrange for all the necessary materials from his own construction site, plus a team of labourers, masons and painters. As he began the work at 9 p.m. in the pouring rain, Mr. Sethi recalled how Lord Krsna had protected the inhabitants of Vrindavan from the devastating rainfall sent by Indra by lifting Govardhan Hill. So he was unperturbed. He was thinking, Indra wants to test me. All right, if you have to come down, you can come down more heavily. But I have the blessings of Srila Prabhupada. I have a temple to build, and I will do it. So it was pouring with rain. It was 9 o'clock at night, and they had to rebuild the temple before the next morning, because as soon as it went to court, they knew the court will pass a stay order. Stay order means status quo. Whatever it, however it is at that moment, that's the way it will remain until the case is finally decided. So if they didn't have a functional temple, at the point, when it went to the court, they wouldn't be able to do the worship anymore. So at 11 p.m., he was challenged by the demolishers, who had threatened to send 150 gundas to help to stop them doing the work. Mr. Sati took out his rifle, and with his son Brij Mohan, who was armed with a pistol, he defiantly told them, "Let them come. They are 150, but we have 200 bullets." Both of them stood waiting, but nobody came. So working throughout the night, they had the temple completed by 4 a.m. in time for Mangalarti. Later that day, Justice 9 issued the court's verdict that what is built and no one can demolish it. So it was a great victory for which Prabhupada was extremely appreciative, and he praised the bravery and the service of Mr. Sati to his movement. So, I haven't put this in here, I'd better do it at some point, but Prabhupada told me later on, he said when that whole thing was going on there, the whole project was jeopardized. So Prabhupada had gone to Radha Rasa Bihari, and he had prayed to them. He said, "My dear sir," he said, "you kindly just sit tight. If you remain here and don't move, I promise you I'll build you a big temple." So there was a deal made between Prabhupada and Radha Rasa Bihari that if they agreed not to move, he would build them a temple. And so he did it. So some special leela was going on there between Prabhupada and those deities. So another aspect that came up about Radha Rasa Bihari. We were in Vrindavan on September the 11th in 1976, and there was some talk about Janmashtami and bathing the deities. So after Prabhupada's breakfast, his breakfast nap, he met with Saurabh, Dhananjaya, Harikesh Swami and Bhagatji. Saurabh Prabhu inquired whether he should design the Singasanas in Bombay so that they could be used for bathing the deities whenever there was a festival, or whether he should make a special arrangement for bathing the deities at the opening of the temple. Prabhupada told him that bathing the large deities should be a one-time affair. Generally, only small deities are bathed, or the Shalagram Shilas are bathed. Harikesh and Dhananjaya said that on Janmashtami in Vrindavan and on Balaram's appearance day, Nitai Das had organised for the big deities here to be bathed. Terrible speculation, Harikesh said. Prabhupada shook his head in irritation. "Therefore the colour has faded?" he asked, adding, "He is a rascal." So this was just when Nitai Das left. And this is another one of his things, that now we should bathe the big deities. Harikesh recalled that he understood that the big deities were never to be washed directly, and even if they were to be covered with a plastic bag. "So why did you allow it?" Prabhupada asked Dhananjaya. "Just see, this is the disease. Rascals, they do not know." So in response, Dhananjaya said that everybody was listening to him. He was posing himself as the most learned in deity worship. That he's very fond of, Prabhupada rightly observed. Dhananjaya said that Nitai was introducing deity worship standards from the Hari Bhakti Vilas. He said his idea was that we would become the most famous temple for bathing big deities in Vrindavan. Harikesh, however, pointed out that in the Hari Bhakti Vilas it states that a smaller set of deities should be used for the bathing functions. Prabhupada tipped his head, adding that the bathing was not to be done on the Singasana. The deity is taken out, then it is done. But that is very risky. You cannot do it. You do not allow him. He is simply posing himself as very learned, above everything. That is his ambition. So returning to the discussion of the Bombay opening, Prabhupada told Saurabh that the same priests who did our Hyderabad temple functions should be invited, and that they would therefore decide the exact arrangements. He said that the deities were not to be bathed on the altar, but rather in front of it. But if it is risky, he said, you should not do. The big deity, we've got big deity there, yes? Yes, Harikesh confirmed, they're very heavy, Radha Rasa Bihari. Prabhupada asked what we had done in Hyderabad, and Harikesh replied that the small deities had been bathed. Anyway, Prabhupada said, we should not take risk at any rate. Harikesh added that Sri Sri Radha Rasa Bihari had been moved to 3 different locations, causing great anxiety for the pujaris, because Srimati Radharani already has a slight crack on her left arm. Prabhupada again admonished the devotees. This risk should not be taken at any gain. Never mind Hari Bhakti Vilas, this Vilas, no risk. You must always know, no risk. That is the first point. Then we shall consult the Hari Bhakti Vilas. Nobody can give reference to Hari Bhakti Vilas at risk. No, not at all. So that's a couple of references there to Radha Rasa Bihari. Then, of course, another deity that Prabhupada installed in India in the early days was Sri Sri Radha Parthasarathi. So they're in Delhi. Of course, Delhi, Hastinapur, that's supposed to be the capital, or nearby the capital where the Pandavas had their kingdom. So Prabhupada named the deities Sri Sri Radha Parthasarathi. Later on, of course, after Prabhupada's disappearance, some people outside of ISKCON questioned the naming of these deities, that somehow or another it was incorrect, because Radha Parthasarathi, how can you have Parthasarathi? He's the driver of the chariot of Arjuna. Then where does Radharani come into that? So some people have criticised that, these deities must have been named, by Prabhupada's disciples. That, Prabhupada himself would never have done that because the name's incorrect. It must have been Prabhupada's disciples. It's just another criticism of, ISKCON's leadership, that's all. However, the question of the naming of these deities came up in 1976 when we were in Nellore in South India. So this was on January the 7th. Prabhupada was out on a morning walk and Achyutananda Maharaj was there. So he asked Srila Prabhupada about 2 deities, one within ISKCON and another one elsewhere. At our New Delhi centre, the deities are called Sri Sri Radha Parthasarathi. Since Parthasarathi means the chariot driver of Arjuna, Achyutananda wanted to know how Radharani, who was only present in Vrindavan Leela, could be included when Krishna